This project was inspired by Bevlish Creations with his modern nightstand. Definitely go and check out his video too. After playing around with a few different designs using SketchUp, I eventually settled on something that I think could work. It wasn't exactly what got built, but it was a good starting point to work from. This is a cherry veneered 3/4 inch plywood sheet. I'm using the track saw to break it down to more manageable sizes and then taking those components to the table saw. Here I'm just ripping each component to the same width and then using the crosscut sled to cut each piece to the same length. To achieve the angled cut on the face of the box, I'll add a solid piece of wood, which I plan on joining with a tongue and groove. Here I'm adding the groove, making sure to rotate the panel for a centered cut. That piece to the left of the blade is what I'll use to make a couple strips. I run them through the thickness planer, leaving them just a little thicker than the plywood. Here I'm just setting up a dado stack blade to create the tongue on those strips of wood. And then cleaning up the tongue with a shoulder plane, achieving a nice tight fit. Once the glue's dried, I flush cut the ends using a track saw. By leaving the strips thicker than the plywood, I can now flush them up using a router. Now, with all the panels ready, I set up the table saw for a 15-degree cut. Here I'm just adding a few dominoes to help with the alignment during glue up. Initially I planned on separating the top and bottom drawer with a shelf. This is me creating the groove for that shelf. I didn't end up using it as I opted for drawer slides instead. And with that, these panels are ready for glue up. I wasn't completely satisfied with these mitered edges, so here I'm creating a rabbet which will accept another strip of solid wood. Now with the carcass complete, it's time to shift focus and start working on the legs. For this to be accurate, I print to scale the side view of the leg. I then cut and paste these sheets to 1/4 inch MDF, which will be my template material. The MDF is then cut and sanded to give me the exact shape of my design. I now use the template to lay out the legs. Here I'll use the domino to join the legs together. With the legs glued and roughly to shape, I used double-sided tape to stick the template to them. I can now use the router to accurately shape them. Now that the legs have been accurately shaped, I can use a 1/2 inch quarter round over on the outside edge of each leg. To create the notch on the legs, I use the track saw for a series of straight cuts, which I then clean up with a chisel and hand plane. Here I'm creating a groove on each leg which will accept the bottom shelf. Now with the legs and carcass complete, they are ready for glue up. This is also the moment where I get to see the project come to life. Here I'm just getting a piece of lumber ready, which will be the top shelf of each dresser. My blade wasn't tall enough to rip through it completely, so I had to finish it up with a handsaw. Those two pieces then get sent through the thickness planer. These pieces were too long for the crosscut sled, so I'm just creating a stop block here. I didn't have a pre-planned design for the top shelf, but here I'm kind of winging it, transferring a few ideas to some leftover template material. I knew I wanted a recessed wireless charger, but I thought I'd also add a recessed small pocket for delicate items like glasses. Now with all that done, it's time to work on the drawers. So this technique is called edge banding. It's actually the first time I've used it, but essentially there's an adhesive on the back side of that strip of wood, and all it does is basically conceal the layers of plywood, which gives it a much nicer finish. As I mentioned, I decided to use drawer slides, so that little shelf separating the top and bottom drawers actually gets removed. I ended up making the drawer pulls with the leftover strips of wood I had in the beginning. For the drawer fronts, I decided to use some leftover maple. Here I'm just figuring out the layout for the drawer pulls, removing the majority of the waste with my router and then finishing it up with a chisel. Actually ended up painting the drawer fronts just for a higher contrast. Here I'm using a template to cut the velvet liner for that top shelf pocket. Getting towards the end now, just finishing off the last couple of things by installing the bottom shelf and closing up the back with a simple piece of 1/4 inch MDF. Let's not forget the drawer fronts and the branding stamp. I ended up doing about 4 or 5 coats per piece and then finished it off with a paste wax. This was definitely a fun, challenging build. Thanks for watching.